How's it going, guys? My name is Donzi and I'm learning game dev. I've tried to stay consistent over the last week and just want to quickly share what I've been doing. I also wanted to say thank you so much for the support in the last video. You guys left a lot of tips in the comments and I hope you'll continue to do so. But without further ado, let's get right into the video. So day 1, I started learning about composition. I watched a video by Coding with Ro, link is in the description, and he had a really good video on it. At least I thought it was a good video, so I'd recommend checking it out. But I'll quickly give a brief explanation of what composition is. Composition is essentially creating systems that can be attached to a number of different objects without having to change the code. As explained in the video, let's say you have a movement component, which holds the movement for your entity, and it only holds the movement, nothing else. This allows you to drag this component onto, for example, your player, allowing them to move, but it also allows you to drag the component onto an enemy, and then the enemy can also move using the same code. So composition is essentially creating many self-sufficient parts that can get connected to various objects. I hope that makes sense. If not, I apologize. Like I said, just go watch the video. I copied the code bar for bar. I don't recommend doing this, but I just wanted to get a basic understanding of what composition was. It took a little getting used to, especially since this was the first time I was making something in 3D. And as of right now, I can definitely say I prefer 2D. I'm sure I will eventually tackle 3D properly, but for now, I just want to focus on 2D. After learning about composition, I tried to replicate Pong, and although it did give me some issues, I got a very basic version working. As you can see, the enemy does stutter when it moves. The ball also doesn't really bounce that great, and it's pretty much impossible to win. But this is not really too interesting, so we'll move on from this. And now the last thing I worked on the past week was a top-down RPG. Yes, the game that literally everybody makes. I'm sure it's a canon event to make one of these, and I mean, it's not a bad idea because it does teach you quite a few things. I was going to follow a tutorial by devlog, but decided to rather try and figure it out myself because I'm not going to learn anything just by copying code. I did use the tutorial videos to determine what I should add, just so that I could focus on one thing at a time instead of overwhelming myself. So the first thing I worked on was the player movement. Now this was my first time moving in multiple directions, being more than only left and right, meaning there would be sprites for every direction. I'll link the sprites in the description, they are not mine and all credit goes to the artist. I created a simple input component to read my inputs being left, right, up and down, as well as the diagonals, and then made a movement component that just moves me in the direction of the input. While creating this, I was also focusing on keeping the code modular using composition, just to help me ingrain the process into my head and to make the code more usable. Also, I would recommend getting some type of background to actually see if your code is working, because I could not determine whether my character was moving or not, or you can just print to the terminal, which also works, which I also didn't do. But moving on. Now that the movement and input was done, I had to figure out a way to assign the sprites without a bunch of if statements, because those get out of hand very quickly. I was also using an animated sprite 2D node instead of an animation player. I know the animation player is better overall, but animated sprite was simpler, so I just went with that. I ended up using a dictionary, which essentially maps a key to a value. So in my case, it maps a direction to a sprite. So I created an animation component which housed the code for the animation. Getting the running animation to work was fine. I just had to check if the direction I was moving was in the dictionary and then play the corresponding animation. The idle animations were giving me some trouble though, because obviously I had to play the idle animation that corresponds to the direction the player is facing. And if I stop moving, it sets the vector to vector 0, which is not in the dictionary. To solve this, I created a variable to store my last facing direction, and this variable would only get changed if the player was moving. Meaning, if the player was standing still, the variable wouldn't update to 0. Then using this variable, I can play the corresponding idle animation whenever the player is standing still, i.e. when their movement vector is 0. Then I also use a simple helper function to flip the player when they move left or right. It took me a while to figure out the diagonals, mainly because I was overthinking, because for some reason I was thinking I'd have to rotate the sprite, and while trying that, this ended up happening. But I realized I just need to play the same sprite for moving sideways when moving on the diagonals. So I had to increase the size of the dictionary to handle the diagonal movements and inputs. And with that, the sprites and movement finally looked good. Oh my goodness, this made me so happy when I did it. Next on the agenda was the Tilemap. And if you are following the tutorial I mentioned, this is slightly different to how it worked in the older versions of Godot. Instead of the Tilemap node, we have the Tilemap layer node. Before you'd have to add layers to get the foreground and background, but now we just add 2 different Tilemap layer nodes, which is exactly what I did. I added one for the ground, one for the obstacles, and one for cliffs. I added my tile sets and quickly created a small world for the player to move around in. But right now, my player doesn't actually collide with anything. It just goes straight through. To fix this, we need to add colliders to the things we want to collide with. To do this, all you have to do is click on the tile set in the inspector, and then go to the physics layer and click add a physics layer. Then we can go to the tile set tab at the bottom, go to paint, and select the physics layer we just created. Then you can select the tiles you want the player to collide with. So in my case, that would be everything on the obstacle layer. With the trees, you can see I only added the physics layer to the bottom instead of the entire tree, and you'll see why this is important. If I were to paint the whole tree with the physics layer, the player would be able to collide with every part of it, meaning the player can't actually go behind the leaves of the tree. It would also block paths and whatnot if it were placed next to the path. So we only make the bottom of the tree collidable so that the player can still move past the leaves. But to get the player to actually appear behind the tree leaves, but in front of the root, we need to use something called Y sort, which basically draws objects on the top of each other depending on the Y level of the objects, meaning objects with a greater high value are drawn over objects with a lower Y value. I will link the video I watched on Y-sort in the description. To use Y-sort, just enable it in the inspector. It's important to note Y-sort will only work if firstly all the objects under a parent, including the parent, have Y-sort enabled, and secondly, have the same z-axis. If your player has a greater z-axis, then Y-sort will not work. If you still see that your player does not appear behind or in front of something properly, you can change the Y-sort origin the same way we did with the physics layer. If you want the player to appear behind an object, make the origin a positive number, and make it a negative number if you want the player to appear in front of the object. It seems simple enough, but when I was doing it, it took me a while to figure out, but after a decent amount of effort, the tile map was finally finished. The final thing I added was an enemy, which consisted of the movement and animation components I already made and a new enemy input component and detection component. With the animation component, all I had to do was redefine the names in the dictionary through the inspector, and just like that, it worked. You have no idea how happy I was that I could simply just reuse what I already did and have it just work. It was such a great feeling and just shows how important composition really is. Now for the input. At first, I was trying to combine the player input and the enemy input, and it was just causing problems, and it was getting really messy. So I decided to separate them, which helped a ton, because that spaghetti code was not working at all. For the new input component, I needed a way for the enemy to go in the direction of the player only if the player was in a specific range. So I needed to find the player's position and then subtract the enemy's position, and that would give me the vector the enemy would use as the direction, as well as for checking if the player was in range. But my original attempts at this left my enemy very confused. Sometimes it would move in my direction and other times it would just freeze. So I did what any programmer ever does and took to the internet. My internet was Gemini. Now before you come at me in the comments for using AI, I don't encourage using AI to do everything for you, but it is a great tool for learning how certain things work and for finding better alternative ways for doing things. That is my stance on it. You're free to have your own opinions. If you do have something to say, please keep it respectful in the comments. Thank you very much. What Gemini told me was to use a global singleton, which is essentially an auto-loaded script that keeps track of something, in my case, the player's position. So I created a new script that genuinely has one line of code and set it as an auto-load in the project settings. Then in the player manager script, under the ready function, I assign the player to the game manager. So now in the detection component script, which is an area 2D node by the way, I find a reference to the player's position through the game manager. Then I can use the on-body entered and exited signals to see if the player entered the area. Then back in the enemy input script, I can use the information from the detection component to get the player's position and calculate the direction vector, which is returned, allowing the enemy manager script to move the enemy in the direction of the player. And boom, we have a working enemy that moves when the player is in range. I still need to figure out the rendering when the slime is on top of the player because it kind of glitches, but I'll try and sort that out some other time. Now I know that seems like a lot, and it kind of was, not gonna lie, it did take me like 3 hours just to get that working. Now for some, it may seem like I did almost nothing in a week, and for others, it may seem like I did a heck of a lot. But it's important to remember that learning game dev is not as simple as opening the engine, going to bed, and suddenly acquiring divine knowledge overnight. This takes time and a heck of a lot of it, and everyone moves at their own pace. So don't get discouraged if stuff seems to take a while to learn. I'm also quite a slow learner myself, and I really don't like it because I like to see results as quick as possible, but that's just not how game dev works. Be patient, and eventually you'll obtain the skills you need. Anyway, if you did enjoy the video or have any tips for me, please do leave them in the comments. Your tips not only help me, but also other beginners who happen to stumble on this video. And if you would like to go the extra mile, a like and a sub is also greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day or night whenever you're watching this, and I'll see you guys in the next one.